Hello, my name is Ryan McBride, and welcome to Critical Thinking for the Rest of Us. Today's lecture, The Power of Critical Thinking. I'm really excited to be giving this new lecture series for everyone, but thought before I jumped in I should try to give a little bit of a background on how the lecture series came about. So, as many of you know, I recently, as of 2024, accepted a position as a professor at Nightingale College, where I primarily teach applied ethics. And it wasn't too far in my employment when I was tasked with coming up with some critical thinking content that we could use either for a course or a lecture series or what have you. In that course of time, I had, of course, met my fellow colleagues, one of whom is a brilliant philosopher named Ben Moss, and quickly learned how dear critical thinking is to him, so much so that he had written a book titled Critical Thinking, Unleashing the Power of Reason. And I approached him and I said, hey, let's get together and collaborate and come up with some content together, since this is, something that's so important to you as well. And so we spent 2024 working over the content, and lo and behold, we developed a lecture series that would first be given to our fellow educators internally. And that lecture series, has been going really well, and the feedback and the reception of the series has been great. And we thought to ourselves, Ben and I, we really believe in the importance and the importance of this content, and believe that, we believe that it shouldn't just be given internally, but also given to the public as well, because, everyone can benefit from this topic. Critical thinking is so important. And so, we decided to adapt that lecture series for a public audience. And that's what this series is the public version of that critical thinking lecture series. That's so much for the history there. I would like to speak a little bit about what this series is going to be covering, what its aim is, and then also, the general format, so you know what to expect over the next several lectures. The scope of the lecture series is covering critical thinking, generally speaking, and its key skills. That leaves me a lot of lateral for speaking here, which is kind of a benefit of it, but I can say that we won't be going in too much depth into informal logic, right? So we won't be going deeply into, for instance, Aristotle's syllogisms or Socratic logic or Stoic logic or anything like this. We're simply trying to get the bare bones, the real meat and potatoes, if you will, of critical thinking, to equip you, the audience, with those key skills so that you can, go and live dangerously with them. We won't, of course, also be getting into formal logic at all. So much for, all the critically important recent developments that have happened in logic over the past couple hundred years. It just doesn't lend itself too well to the lecture format. So what's our aim? This kind of goes back to what I was just saying about how this series came to be. But Ben and I recognized, we recognize, we live in a digital age. And, each and every one of us, we have access to unlimited information just in virtue of having a cell phone, for instance. And that's both beautiful and horrible, right? Because what's absolutely true, I believe, is that almost all of the information we encounter, even if it's monetarily free up front, is absolutely not free in any real sense, simply because all the information that we encounter on a day-to-day basis, whether it be political, social, whatever it is all geared towards influencing us in some way. Usually in order to garner praise or favor or support or even financial support even, right? So all information we encounter, there's an agenda of some sort, right? Even the information I'm giving here has an agenda, and I'm trying to be transparent and lay that out to you. Of course, that isn't new per se just to the digital age. That's sort of just true in terms of information in general, is that it's given with some aim or agenda in mind, and that's well and good. But that's also why critical thinking is so critical. But something that's very interesting that is unique to the digital age or our contemporary age is the advent of artificial intelligence, which I can tell you, as a educator, that it's being taken on or taken up as a replacement for thinking in general. A lot of students now, they, rather than writing a paper and say like a philosophy paper on the trolley problem and trying to think through the ramifications of utilitarianism and Kantian ethics and, should I flip the switch or not? They just put it into some artificial intelligence program. I'm trying to be general here. I know what they are. I'm just trying not to name any specific ones. And they prompt these large language models to think for them, and of course rob themselves in the process of the opportunity to practice thinking. And so, this critical thinking series is meant to try to curb that subtly, the inundation of information, but also this incorrect taking up of artificial intelligence. And something I did want to say as well is it's not simply a student's problem or, of course it is a public issue or however you want to carve this up, but if even, fellow educators are taking it up as well. And, most educators, of course, appreciate the importance and they can appreciate the subtlety of when and how to use these tools. But nevertheless, it's always great to go back to the fundamentals and review what is critical thinking and why is it important, right? So I was trying to think of a good analogy for understanding kind of more viscerally of what's going on here with critical thinking versus versus the age we live in. And I kind of imagined, if you think of yourself as being in a little boat out at sea, and then the storm comes and you're just being inundated with rain and your little boat's being tossed back and forth, that's somewhat equivalent to the situation that we face as individuals today, just being inundated with information. It's just nonstop. And much of that information is trying to capsize us for whatever reason. So where does critical thinking come in? Well, critical thinking is that capacity you have to take up your oar or to pull your sail in search of more favorable winds, right? Or just to simply propel yourself as best as you can, right? Not perfectly, you might fail, but at least propel yourself the best you can out of this stormy situation and hopefully sail to calmer waters. So in this analogy, critical thinking is that, that power of self-direction, or even the tools, if you will, to get you moving in the direction you want to go, right? So all told, we believe the aim of this series is to just give listeners the tools they need to navigate the information that we're just inundated with today in a way that is both beneficial for them and also protective, or serves as a protective measure for them, or for you, I should say, right? It's for you. So this content in these lectures are meant to benefit you and show you how you can protect yourself from this, onslaught of information. So finally, the format, what to expect. I'm projecting that we'll have about 12 or so lectures proper, in which I will be, of course, lecturing, and then I will end. I always think it's good to end with homework because, I'm an educator. So I'll be ending with some reflection questions that I invite you to take up and answer on your own time as best as you can. And think about critically, right? And write about it. Think about these questions and see, how they spark you to think more about the information that was given in the lecture. However, I am a student of Socrates. And what I mean by that is I really believe in the power of dialogue. And a little etymology here, the word dialogue is such a neat Greek word because it means the two logos, or the two minds coming together, the dialogos. And my belief as a child of Socrates' thought is that the truth is cooperative. The truth is pursued together in community. The truth is not discovered by monologue, right? The truth isn't discovered by me babbling in a void. It happens through cooperation. Of course, very difficult to do in a lecture format like this. Nevertheless, I do intend to prompt you, the listener, throughout this series in some form or fashion when able, just to make sure that we are, even if it's artificial, we're doing the best we can to have that dialogue. Finally, something, that's going to be unique to this external version of this lecture series is that I do intend to have additional lectures given where they really serve as Q&As, where Ben is actually able to join me, and us two will be answering, perhaps, depending on reactions to this lecture series. If folks have questions, right, and they want to send them in or email me or write them in YouTube or what have you, or wherever this is posted, we would like to have a forum where Ben's also able to, jump in and communicate and answer these questions. He has a very fine mind, and it'll be wonderful to listen to him think. Of course, if there isn't a lot of immediate public engagement and the lecture series keeps rolling along, well, I'm sure that I can pick Ben's brain as much as anyone. So we'll figure it out. But do expect to have. I'm thinking probably about 3 or 4 lectures where it's Ben and I both presenting. Otherwise, it will just be me. And this is also how it's happening in the internal lecture series as well, as I'm sort of the figurehead, the speaker, but of course I collaborated and aided the content along as well. So our agenda today will be answering 4 specific questions. What is critical thinking? Why is critical thinking important? What are the key skills involved in critical thinking? And finally, how can you begin to apply critical thinking skills in your life today? So, what is critical thinking? First, recognize what we have here is a compound noun of sorts with a modifier and a head noun. So we have critical, the modifier, the adjective, and thinking, the noun. It's a gerund noun. Ooh, nerdy grammar. I love it. So what I thought is, before we can really dive into what critical thinking is, we might as well just ask ourselves, well, what is thinking? It's an insane question to ask on its own, but I nevertheless am going to invite you to pause me here and ask yourself what you think what thinking is in itself. So I'll pause myself here for 5 seconds so you can hit the pause button or what have you and ask yourself that. Good. So thinking, you could spend your whole life thinking about what thinking is, and some people have done that. But for pragmatic purposes, I'm going to offer what I think thinking is and how I'll be tackling it for this lecture series. And again, invite you to see if that lines up with your own conception of it, or, if it's interchangeable or what have you. So the first thing I notice when I think about thinking, even in my head, just, in the privacy of my own mind, is that thinking often develops or generates from or utilizes language, right? It comes forth, unfolds. That's the word I wanted. It unfolds in language. It's linguistic. Thinking is by and large linguistic. And because it's linguistic or connected to language, I do recognize that thought is a little weirder than just language. It's its own thing. But again, we're pursuing pragmatic purposes here. We have pragmatic purposes here. So this process utilizes language, and language itself, even though it's infinite and sprawling and ever changing, it is nevertheless regular, right? If language didn't have regular patterns to it, well, we wouldn't be able to communicate very well. And so something we can recognize right off the bat is that language itself, which thinking utilizes, is regular. It has patterns to it. Furthermore, it also has operators of a kind, right? So we have and, or, not, therefore, etc. And these pieces, these conjunctions, they hold certain powers to them, right? When I use the conjunction and, you know that I'm doing something additive with my language. Or if I use the word or, you know that I'm being potentially exclusive of the things that I'm speaking about. Or can also be an inclusive in logic, but that's beside the point right now. If I use the conjunction, is not a conjunction. I don't think it is a conjunction, actually. It's just negation. I'm wrong. Or maybe I'm right. I don't know. I'm not confident right now. But anyways, if I use not, you know that I'm negating something. I'm going to take away whatever it is I'm saying in the moment. And then, of course, we have therefore. This is a very powerful conjunction in our language, which shows a causal connection of some sort between the first thing I said and the second thing I said. So language, it has patterns and has these operators or conjunctions with that, and they hold a lot of power. Well, in this way, language is very similar, or at least through the eyes of critical thinking, right? We're getting to it. It's very similar to math, where math, we have these operations, we have these formulas that are considered well-formed, and these are the ones that we use to achieve the ends that we have in math, right? So if I want to determine the radius of a circle and I have some amount of information, I'll use a specific formula to determine that radius. I can calculate it from that formula. Well, in a similar way, I invite you to think of critical thinking as simply taking advantage of the regularities of language and these operators to identify when those patterns are well formed, right? So critical thinking in general is, just for our purposes, all critical thinking is thinking with good form. But at a finer level, critical thinking is identifying those well-formed thought patterns and distinguishing them from ill-formed thought patterns, the latter of which absolutely exists. So, the clumsiness of the analogy doesn't mean that, when I'm thinking poorly, I'm thinking in gibberish, right? This isn't the direction critical thinking is taking us. It's actually identifying very common patterns of thinking that we rely on a day-to-day basis that are simply illogical and yet nevertheless so regularly employed that they have their own names, right? They're called the informal fallacies. And close cousins to the informal fallacies are the cognitive biases, right? So quick example of an informal fallacy is the ad hominem, in which my way of reasoning involves attacking the person or the thing that I'm talking about. Well, that's not very logical, actually. It's really poorly formed. So if I say you shouldn't believe in anything the Democratic Party says because the Democratic Party is stupid, well, this is from the perspective of critical thinking, this is a really, really poorly formed argument. It's just simply illogical, right? So critical thinking identifies these patterns, pushes forward the well-thinking patterns, and of course encourages practices in those patterns while giving us the tools we need to identify poor thinking and how we can steer away from it. Now, if we want a more formal definition of critical thinking, the one that we'll operate with here is that critical thinking is the objective analysis and evaluation of information to form reasoned judgments. So I'll say that again because that was a bit of a mouthful as well as a headful to take in, I imagine. But a formal definition of critical thinking for us is the objective analysis and evaluation of information to form reasoned judgments. Why is critical thinking important? I've, of course, already spoken about this, having introduced the aim of the lecture series. Nevertheless, I think it bears repeating. Why is critical thinking important? So first off, recognize that because critical thinking is a kind of modification of thought itself, you will, no matter what, if you're listening to me now, no matter what you do, you will spend the rest of your life thinking. This is a fact. We are linguistic animals. That's the kind of things that we are. So the question becomes for you to kind of pass the buck here is, do you want to think well, or do you just want to think maybe well, probably not well, and just go about your day-to-day life, right? If it's something you have to do, I think it's fair to say, you might consider trying to do that thing well and not just simply take it for granted, even though it's so close to home. Thinking is so close to home. So why is critical thinking important? Is because it develops your capacity to do what you're sort of damned to do for the rest of your life, which is to think, right? So if you want to do it well, critical thinking is the way to do that. That is a great start to developing your critical thinking skills. Second, yes, we are inundated with information right now. Political, social, just, oh my gosh, so much. And part of that is, based on the fact that we have infinite access to anything in the world in terms of information, right? So, as absurd as this is going to sound as an example, it's nevertheless true. In the matter of an hour, right now, any one of us, for the most part, anyone listening, can get on a computer and Google how to do flower arrangement. If they've never done it before, they can Google this and they can learn it. That's amazing. It's also totally possible to Google how to create pipe bombs. Everything is at our fingertips. It's truly wonderful, horrifying, absurd, and utterly overwhelming. Of course, too, even without taking the active part out of that, of us searching for information, we're constantly being barraged with information. A lot of it coming through in the form of political discourse, but also, especially here in the West and specifically in the U.S., a lot of the information we encounter on a day-to-day basis is coming through via the form of a sales pitch, right, of some kind. So personal anecdote I noticed, having studied in Europe and then coming back to the U.S., is that on any given day, it is almost impossible as a U.S. inhabitant to not have someone or something try to sell something to you, right? It's just constant barrage of information in the form of a sales pitch or what have you. The belief, to bring it back to the topic here, the belief is that critical thinking sharpens our awareness so that we can identify when information's coming in, what kind of information's coming in, the quality of that information, and then absolutely the purpose or the aim of that information. So again, critical thinking sort of serves as a screen or as a protective barrier so that we're no longer just being, again, I can't think of any better word than just inundated with information. Third, which is very unique to our time frame here, is that we live in a time where you pretty much can't get on any internet service of any kind without some company pushing forward their artificial intelligence bot or their artificial intelligence tool to just take, it's meant, I think fundamentally that people are good and this all means well. And I also do recognize that a lot of this is about, these companies and these services generating, wealth and profit for whatever. But for all intents and purposes, or at least for our intents and purposes, we can see that AI, by and large, is meant to replace our own capacities for thinking, because there's this idea that, well, we're fallible in our thinking. Well, hey, guess what? This is true, right? But the answer is not, well, we can just use someone to think for us or something to think for us. Speaking to the idea of someone thinking for us, this is already something that we all have to deal with, right? We're all sort of born into the world and we're given, a set of beliefs, often from our parents or authoritative figures. And then we come into the age of reason and we, hopefully test and shed or develop and modify these beliefs and make them our own, right? That's the great human drama here. Well, that's become a little bit harder now with this advent of these tools that are trying to now take that space from us as well, right? So as a sideline here, a sidebar, I like to joke with colleagues and stuff that like the role of a teacher of philosophy or a lecturer in philosophy, one of the roles is to emancipate our students, or to participate in that practice of self-emancipation that students go through, particularly in their late teens, early 20s, when they get to the college scene and they start to ask themselves, well, do I actually believe what my parents believe, and why? Or why don't I? Or why is this not sitting well with me, right? Well, philosophy is really great because it helps in that process, often in a salubrious way, but also in a way that can speed that process up. Well, the task, at least for some of us, is doubly difficult, or at least for me is doubly difficult, because right as I have my students starting to appreciate the importance of challenging their own assumptions and beliefs, they go in and they put their questions into AI and effectively ask AI to think for them instead. And it's like, what the hell are you doing? We just spent 4 weeks on trying to get you to just shed these preconceptions, and now you're getting a computer to think for you, right? It's the most defeating and frustrating thing ever. And also, I tend to keep a very ironic distance where I can kind of look at this and just kind of laugh, because I do recognize that there's so little I can do here, and I'm trying my best, but it's the absurd fact of the present moment that we live in. And so critical thinking, to bring it back here, I believe, will help us to recognize the importance, but also the limitations of artificial intelligence. And so just a general, not a watchword, but a watch phrase I want you to keep in mind, if it doesn't come up again, is just recognize that AI can't, and I would say ought not, think for you, but it can think with you. Or you can think with it, right? AI is simply a tool, but it never will be able to replace what you are able to do with and in your own mind. So critical thinking, to bring it back here, sharpens our capacity to think, which is something we're already doing and we're going to continue to do. Second, it helps protect us and sort through the inundation of information that we face on a day-to-day basis. And then third, it can help us to recognize the importance and the limitations of artificial intelligence. What are the key skills involved in critical thinking? Well, first and foremost, critical thinking teaches us how to identify arguments. So what is an argument? It does not involve, for our purposes, getting in a shouting or fighting match with someone, right? That's not what we have in mind. For our purposes, an argument is a kind of verbal or written discourse that we engage in order to motivate a position that we hold, or a claim that we want to forward, or a belief that we want to share. So critical thinking teaches us to identify, we have an argument on our hands here. Now, arguments are not simple things. They're compound things. They involve other component pieces that, of course, critical thinking teaches us to identify and to appreciate. And that is the premises and the conclusion of the argument. So critical thinking teaches us how, when we're being given information, it teaches us how to identify, this is a premise to the argument. This is the conclusion. Well, what are those things? A conclusion is the final claim or aim or purpose of the argument itself. It's the thing that I'm trying to motivate. So if I come to you and I say, Socrates is mortal, you'll probably have no issue accepting this, but nevertheless, this is a claim, and it's one that requires evidence to motivate. It can't simply be taken for granted, or it can because it's so uncontroversial. But so we have the conclusion, Socrates is mortal. But now I need evidence. I need to support that claim. And that's where the premises come in. So I'm going to offer what is known as a deductive argument to demonstrate infallibly, unlike my English, that Socrates is indeed immortal. First, here's my evidence. First premise, all men are mortal. Second premise, Socrates is a man. If you accept this, and I think you should accept both premises because they're fairly uncontroversial, then it naturally follows that Socrates is mortal. So that argument that I just gave, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, is known as modus ponens. It's a well-formed deductive argument. And it means that if you accept the premises, the conclusion is absolutely true. You can't get away from it because it has a good formula. Critical thinking teaches us to identify those formulas. It teaches us to identify the premises, the evidence, and then it teaches us to identify the core claim that's being pushed forward. Next, critical thinking teaches us to evaluate the quality and the content of the premises, as well as if the conclusion follows from the premises. So if the argument itself is well formed, which is also known as being sound. So now what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to give you a goofy example that I like to give my students, in which I use that same argument, modus ponens, but I change the content. So here it goes. Meerkats are the cutest animals in the world. Ryan is a meerkat. Therefore, Ryan is the cutest animal in the world. Same argument, same formula, conclusion naturally follows from the premises, but hold on. This is absurd. Because I'm obviously, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, I haven't thought about it, I am not the most cute animal in the world. Why? Well, because I'm not a meerkat. If I was a meerkat, that would be true. And so something happened here. Basically, the conclusion doesn't follow because the premises aren't true. So let's go back. Now we're doing the evaluative portion of what critical thinking teaches us to do. So we looked at the first premise. Meerkats are the cutest animals in the world. Now, I'm not going to argue with you about whether or not that's true because it absolutely is true. Meerkats are absolutely, as a matter of fact, the cutest animals in the world. It's written in the Bible. Everyone knows this. Okay, so we can accept premise one. Premise two, Ryan is a meerkat. Well, okay, that's where we went off the rails. I'm obviously not a meerkat. And so it doesn't follow that I'm the cutest animal in the world because premise two is false. Bear in mind, it can still happen that I can push forward a conclusion. The premises can be false, and the conclusion can be true. It's spurious, but it can happen. Critical thinking teaches us how to evaluate premises and sound them out for their evidence and determine whether or not they're true. And then, of course, too, it helps us to evaluate those arguments and determine whether or not they're well-formed, which will adjust and change how seriously we take the conclusion that's being brought forward. Next, critical thinking also gives us, by way of practice, a handful of what is known as the intellectual virtues. I'm not going to go too deeply into this. I am going to introduce two now because the next two lectures are actually going to be about these intellectual virtues. But something that critical thinking gives us is these intellectual virtues. And two of the most critical or important ones are the virtues of charity and the virtues of skepticism. As we study critical thinking, we develop what is generally known as the principle of charity, or we proceed from the principle of charity. And the principle of charity is the idea that when we're engaging in argument or dialogue with someone or something, we proceed with the charitable assumption that first and foremost, we have something to learn here. I might not necessarily take up the ideas of the person that I'm engaging with or the thing I'm engaging with, but I can learn something, even if the thing that I learn is that the thing that I'm engaging with is false. So we start in the principle of charity, or in the intellectual virtue of charity. We proceed with this sense of, I have something to learn here. Notice that there's a little humility already built into this, and that's also a component piece of charity as well as the intellectual virtues. So much so that we're actually going to talk about humility down the road specifically. But we proceed as if we have something to learn. And then we actively listen. Right? We engage with the content, we engage with the people, we quiet our minds and we take it in because we believe we have something to learn here. Perhaps the person we're engaging with is an expert in their field. And so it would do us well to be silent, to not think, but to receive. Do a little active listening. Active listening is very difficult. I think it's difficult for many people. I think it's difficult in its own way for intellectually oriented people. It's hard for me to actively listen because when I'm stimulated intellectually, I immediately start thinking, and then I want to share and I want to participate, right? But part of the principle of charity requires or invites us to simply listen and to receive. So the principle of charity and the intellectual virtue of charity, as we'll call it, is this idea that we engage in argumentation and we engage in knowledge with the belief that we have something to learn, and that in order to learn it, we have to proceed with humility and active listening, right? We have to proceed with open ears and open minds and open hearts. We set aside our preconceived notions about the way the world is, and we just listen. If that's all critical thinking gave us, or bequeathed to us, as I said, through training, that wouldn't be good, right? Because not everything we engage with needs to be taken seriously, first and foremost. So let me just say that in a different way. Being charitable doesn't mean that everything in the world that we encounter deserves an audience, right? So something that's wonderful about, if we look at the First Amendment in the U.S., right, the freedom of speech. The freedom of speech guarantees that I am able to communicate my ideas, right? This is awesome. I shall not be silenced. That doesn't mean anyone has to listen to your ideas. And in the same way, critical thinking is not saying that everything that we engage with deserves an audience. So, of course, we're going to learn to evaluate information and determine whether or not it's worth digging into. But what critical thinking is not getting us, or not asking us to do, is just to accept everything and just to engage with everything in a way that we're sort of, intellectual pushovers or whatnot. And so, okay, well, what's the opposite of charity? Well, it's skepticism. So what we also develop as we develop our critical thinking skills is a bit of healthy skepticism. And that's where, while we proceed in the spirit of charity, we also proceed without taking anything for granted. Anything that's coming into this holy temple of my mind, it doesn't get a free pass. The doors are open, but it doesn't get to go through without some questioning. And of course, the purpose isn't questioning necessarily for the sake of questioning, but for sounding out. So what makes skepticism so important as an intellectual virtue is that it reminds us to not take anything for granted. Meaning we get to ask that question our parents told us to stop asking when we were really young, which is why? Why do you think this? Why is that true? Why is that the best evidence you can rally? Why is that the source that you rely on? Why should I trust that source, right? So skepticism is that inquisitive, questioning attitude. So charity is not naivety. The principle of charity, or the intellectual virtue of charity, were it on its own, of course, might lead us into a mindset of naivety, but we balance that out as critical thinkers with the spirit of skepticism. So we're not pushovers. So we proceed recognizing that we have something to learn, but we also proceed with the belief that nothing can be taken for granted. So the last thing I want to say is that what critical thinking also doesn't want us to do is to fall too far on the side of skepticism, right, where we totally abandon the principle of charity and we devolve into what is known as cynicism. I'm not speaking about ancient Greek cynicism or ancient Roman cynicism, but the idea that anything we encounter is wrong or unbeneficial and unwarranted and can be dismissed outright. That's what cynicism is. It's the roadway to nihilism, if you will, and it's just and that's the kind of cynicism I'm trying to identify here. And so if charity is not tempered by skepticism, we get naivety. While skepticism that's not tempered by charity devolves into cynicism, and we absolutely don't want that, because operating within the mindset of cynicism, it's inactivating, right? It's very depowering, and it's also, cynicism in this sort of sense is, it's not true, because there are things that are true, and there are things that are worth embracing, and there are things that are pragmatically useful, and there are things that are beautiful and salubrious, and things that elevate our spirit. But if we fall into a cynical attitude, the colors start to desaturate, if you will, and we lose sight of the beauty of the drama that we're all partaking in here. So to bring it back to, what are some of the key skills involved with critical thinking? To summarize, critical thinking is going to teach us to identify arguments, their formulas, and the component pieces of those formulas. It's going to teach us to evaluate those component pieces and whether or not those formulas are well formed. And then it's also going to bequeath onto us these intellectual virtues. There's several of them, right? So we talked a little bit about charity and skepticism. We're also going to be talking about courage, humility, and so many more. So much to come in the series on that. Critical thinking also gives us these intellectual virtues, which we develop through practice as we practice our critical thinking skills in general. How can you begin to apply critical thinking skills today? Well, since critical thinking just is the intentional, practiced form of doing what you already do, which is to think, critical thinking skills can quite literally be applied everywhere in your life. But I have 3 specific areas in your life that you can apply critical thinking skills today. So first, you can apply critical thinking skills to those times when you're assessing the news. I spoke at length about this idea that, we're kind of lost in the sea of information. And part of what makes that information so tumultuous is that it's political in nature. We can't get away from that. But, I think it's fair to say that we can recognize, again, at least in the U.S., that a lot of the most accessible news forms that we have access to, or news outlets or news sources, they vary in quality, but what they all have in common is that they're absolutely trying to motivate some political view, which is often, again, in the US, it's binary. You're either left or you're right. And, and there's a question of how extreme you are on either end, but you basically only get to pick that. So there's already, even the way that the news is presented to us is either, you're a leftist or you're on the right. And if you're on either side, you're the enemy of the other, and you're an idiot either way, because no one on one side thinks the other side, blah, 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 right? And so when assessing the news, we're just the whole premise of the news and politics in general in the U.S. is just so heated and binary, and honestly, to be quite frank with you, not very critical in the nature of its thought and its arguments. And so, to kind of bring it more to a fine grain, like I said, the news, it has a purpose. I don't want to be cynical here, but a lot of the times the news isn't aimed at informing as it is influencing us to take up the cause of, again, in the US at least, the right or the left. Because it has that purpose and it's charged in that way. The way it's presented is it's presented in a way to motivate you to lean one way or the other. Well, when we don't have our critical thinking hats on, we're humans, right? And we're still humans when we critically think, but we're emotional beings. There's so many. Being a human being it's a rich tapestry. It's a rich experience, and it's not just logical. It's emotional. And these news sources, they recognize this, right? And so they leverage that. And so a lot of the quote unquote argumentation, the term is persuasion here, is emotively based. So you shouldn't believe in X, Y, or Z because he or she is an idiot, or they're trying to kill people, or they're trying to let other people steal our jobs and all this stuff. And a lot of the way this information is presented to us is emotionally charged, but it's not supported by any means with good and sound evidence, let alone whether or not it's even well-formed or formed into an argument of any kind. It might just be sheer persuasion or mere persuasion. And so critical thinking, teaches us to kind of slow down and again, screen. I think of it like screening out coffee grounds or something. And you take the solid particles out and you try to find, well, what is the thing that these people in this news source is what are they trying to communicate to me? How are they communicating it? And is it right? What is the evidence? Is that evidence right? So critical thinking teaches us to kind of slow down with all this news information and, just ask ourselves, well, what's going on here? Second, engaging in social media. So I have to confess from the beginning here, I have a very low opinion of social media. I'm actually currently not on any social media. I'm proud to say, actually, that I deleted my last connection to social media this year, 2025. I deleted permanently my Instagram account, and I don't miss it. I am biased in the sense that I see little or no value for my purposes in social media. I don't find it to be a good source of entertainment. I absolutely don't find it to be a good source of information for the most part, I guess. I've found some pretty good bands on Instagram, for instance, but I just generally I'm very skeptical of social media, and even more so in our current political climate in the US specifically, being aware of the people and the companies that own these social media outlets, and their political alignments. I like my social media and my entertainment to be to not have ulterior motives, even if only in part. And so I don't think that our social media in the US is free of political opinion or ulterior motive, among other things. Again, I just actually think that social media, by and large, today, in the form that it's in today, is incredibly unhealthy. Nevertheless, if you're on social media, and if you are, good for you, it can be fun, and it can be a great source of staying connected with local businesses and tattoo artists and finding bands and keeping up. Maybe keeping up with your friends. I kind of think that that's not what social media is about anymore at all. But nevertheless, see, I can't even speak about this topic without getting maybe a little cynical here. But critical thinking teaches us to navigate the social media landscape in a way that may or may not help us carve out those nuggets of truth that are to be found there. And of course, when we are encountered with an argument of sorts, either from friends, family, entertainment sources, news sources, what have you, critical thinking will absolutely, when we apply it, will allow us to navigate that space in a way that we're able to protect ourselves more, and also to just do so in a way it's just more beneficial or to our own ends. And then finally, I'm, in my 30s now and finally becoming an adult. I don't know if I'm proud to say that or ashamed, but I'm, something that I recognize is very important to all of us, and something we are going to inevitably be doing in this world we live in is dealing with finances. And so critical thinking skills on even a practical level can help us, for instance, to scrutinize market trends, or if we are speaking to an investing company or investor and they say, oh, you should invest in X, Y, and Z. Well, why? And critical thinking, teaches us how to navigate that why and evaluate the evidence that investor will present us with. Well, I think, X, Y, and Z is projected to be good because of blah, 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 blah. Well, is that true? Does the argument there make sense? Is it relevant? All these things are questions that critical thinking helps us to take up. So that's another sort of practical way that critical thinking can benefit you now, right? So to review, critical thinking, you can apply it today in your assessment of news. You can apply it today in how you engage in social media. And then in a very practical sense, you can also apply it in the way that you manage your finances. So there you have it. We've answered the following questions. What is critical thinking? Why is critical thinking important? What are the key skills involved in critical thinking? And finally, how can I begin to apply these critical thinking skills in my life today? So as promised, I now want to leave you with a few questions for you to take up and reflect on in your own time. My first question for you. What were your preconceptions of critical thinking prior to listening to this lecture? And how has what we've discussed today already challenged those preconceptions? Question 2. In what ways do you recognize yourself already engaging in critical thinking? In what ways have you fallen short of it? Question 3. Is critical thinking still relevant today, do you think, in a time when large language models and other similar tools are able to think for us, if indeed they are? So thank you so much for tuning into this lecture, The Power of Critical Thinking. And again, if you have questions about the content from today, please feel free to leave comments below, if applicable, or please feel free to reach out to me via email. And I'll be collecting your questions to present to Ben and myself in other sessions. Next week, we'll be talking about the intellectual virtues, specifically curiosity and open-mindedness. Take care.